Well, good afternoon. I'm Paul Salem, currently the acting president at the Middle East Institute. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome you all here to today's panel, moderated by MEI's Marvin Weinbaum. This panel will be recapping and assessing the impact of the recent elections in Pakistan. Former cricket superstar Imran Khan was elected as the new prime minister. His party, Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, will take over the legislature. And many questions remain as how Khan will address issues such as Pakistan's weakened economy, relations with the U.S., and efforts to combat extremism. His July 26 victory speech was moderate in tone, but his support of conservative causes, populist rhetoric, and increasingly close ties to the military might indicate a more hardline approach. Given this complicated start, how is Khan expected to engage with his own base, as well as pursue an effective foreign policy strategy? Here to discuss these issues, we're delighted to have an expert panel moderated by my colleague Marvin Weinbaum. Dr. Weinbaum is the director of the Afghanistan and Pakistan program here at MEI and a resident scholar here. He's also professor emeritus of political science at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Previously, he served as an analyst for Pakistan and Afghanistan in the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Intelligence and Research from 1999 to 2003. And at Illinois, Dr. Weinbaum directed the program on South Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. Marvin will also introduce our excellent panel today. And before turning it over to him, let me mention that this event is being recorded and there's also television cameras with us, so please put your cell phones on silent. But we do encourage tweeting, and if you do tweet, please use the hashtag MEIPakistan. Thanks again for coming. Please join me in welcoming Marvin and the excellent panel.
Thank you, Paul. It's a pleasure on this sultry summer afternoon to be able to know we can still find people who are interested in Pakistan, where I assure you it's warmer than it is here, in more ways than one. It is a stellar panel that we have, and you have their bios. I'm not going to take our time except to say that we have on my far left here Michael Kugelman. And Michael, many of you know already for being Deputy Director of the Asia program over at the Wilson Center. And if you don't know him from that, you certainly would be aware of him from the many, many publications that he has. People say, is this one person? I assure you it is, and a very prolific one person. But more than that, the quality of his analysis is really quite remarkable. And to my left here, Arif Rafiq. Arif comes down from New York City, but is nevertheless a non-resident scholar here at the Middle East Institute and a president of Vizier Consulting. And Arif is known really by many people here for the excellent studies that he's done, extensive studies that he's done on issues in Pakistan. He also is quite renowned for his writing a weekly column in the Pakistan Express Tribune, which is associated with the New York Times. And that's the leading English language daily. So we're delighted to have Rafiq, one of our own, with us. Tamina Salukuddin is probably has as good credentials as you can have in terms of giving us the perspective not only from her, based on her own understanding, but having been both at the State Department and the White House. And Tamina is now with the U.S. Institute of Peace, where she specializes in peace studies, and rightly so, because when she was at State, she was on the team that was responsible for looking at ways to reach a peaceful outcome in Afghanistan under the special representative. So thank you for joining us, Tamina. And Moeed Yusuf, who I've known for a long time. Moeed is probably as well known in Pakistan as he is in the United States, and for good reason, because when you want really level-headed analysis on Pakistan, it's Moeed who gives it to you straight. And he's the Associate Vice President at the Asian Center at USIP, U.S. Institute of Peace. And Moeed, of course, is in Pakistan well known because he's writes for Friday Times, which is certainly the leading weekly English language publication in Pakistan. So altogether, I think we've got what is, as I say, a stellar panel. So let's start off, and we're going to try to get as many questions that I'm going to be raising in, and as much dialogue as we can, and leave time for you to raise questions. But we're going to be looking forward, but before we do that, I'm going to ask our panel if they would just briefly, very briefly, say what accounts for PTI's rather unexpectedly large margin of success in this election, which took place on the 25th of last month. So who'd like to start us off? Michael?
Sure. Well, thanks, Marvin. Is this on? Can everyone hear me? Yes, there we go. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor. I think that, answering this question, one tends to think of two dominant narratives that have really driven this election and its analysis, and both of these dominant narratives are incorrect in my view. One is that the army, the Pakistani army, essentially stage managed this very intricate operation to bring millions of people to the side of Imran Khan, and that's why the PTI won. The other dominant narrative is that the army essentially did not do anything, and it stayed in the barracks, and essentially the popularity of the PTI and the struggles of the PMLN party led to the victory that we got. I think that the truth is clearly somewhere in between. I would argue, quite frankly, that the playing field was not level. The electoral playing field was not level. There were a series of things that happened over the last year, ranging from quite a few parliamentarians switching their allegiances to the PTI, the arrests of a number of PMLN leaders, several top leaders being sentenced to jail and put in prison very soon before the election, media crackdowns on outlets perceived to be too friendly to the PMLN. Now, if one or two of these things had happened in isolation, no big deal, but the fact that all of this happened, I think, is reason for concern. But that said, another reason why the PTI did as well as it did is that it is truly a popular party. This is forgotten. It has a very key support base. There's a critical constituency, I would argue, of young, conservative, middle class, urban folks, particularly in Punjab, which is the key electoral prize, and they voted for the party. So I'll say that, and very briefly, just a few other factors that may account for PTI's
You're not going to leave anything for the rest of them to
Okay,
talk
I'll stop
about.
right there. Absolutely, sure. That was probably more than a minute.
Tamara.
Sure. I fully agree with Michael that it's probably a host of factors. I think some, obviously the Army and you could say the establishment judiciary actions over the past year and more than that definitely influenced the election. But some of the other structural factors that I think are interesting, since 2008, PTI support among Pashtuns has really grown. And if you look at Pashtun Tahafuz movement, there is a movement to try to exert more Pashtun rights and a Pashtun identity. And I think being from Miawali, Imran Khan has played up some of his Pashtun roots and has done really well in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, including in the government last year. Not that he had a great, compared to the ANP government, it wasn't a very high bar to pass. Secondly, I think the changing demographics, which Michael alluded to, actually do help. There is a huge urbanizing youth bulge under the age of 29, conservative or not conservative, actually. I think in Pakistan there isn't really a leftist party. PPP has often claimed to be, but I don't think anyone's looking for ideology so much. I think Imran Khan's popularity from his time as cricket captain and on has been phenomenal on both sides of the spectrum. So I think that energy that I even saw when election monitoring in 2013, he could bring people out into the streets, definitely helped him, along with, I think, some military and establishment help.
Wait.
Yeah, not much left to say, but I guess the way I would come at this is that the catalyst here, I think the underlying reasons have been pointed out. The catalyst was Nawaz Sharif's legal troubles. Essentially, in Punjab especially, traditionally, the Pakistani voter, the Punjabi voter at least, votes for the winner. And what you had in this election is an aura that became very clear over time, that there was one party that was going to be put in the dock and was going to lose, and the other one that was ascendant. And that actually, I think, pushed the voter ultimately to realize where the vote should go. The other part of this is the real interesting one, and somebody, a PhD student should unpack this as a dissertation. Why did Imran win in KPK? The KPK has never brought an incumbent back. And there I think it is governance. And governance because PTI is one party that actually did go towards local governments and better delivery in KP. So it's a combination of the aura created that Nawaz out, Imran in, and governance in KP, which I think combined to get him the margin that he did.
You just want to follow up on?
Yeah, just a quick comment on the KPK governments. I think if you look at constituencies, you see a pretty good example of this. For example, in DI Khan, where Fazlur Rahman lost his seat almost by double the number of votes to somebody who had served, Mr. Gandapur, who had served in the provincial government. So you see a lot of PTI provincial government holders who were MPAs before becoming MNAs, which I think is exactly an example of that. Now, I don't buy that Fazlur Rahman only got 40,000 votes and Mr. Gandapur got 80,000. It seems a little off balance, but I think that win is just one example. If you look constituency by constituency, you see a lot of this. People who did well first at the province level, then coming to the national level.
Right. Arif.
I think, if you look at public opinion data from the beginning of this year, PTI essentially was within around 10 to 12 points of PMLN. So it was going to perform much better than it had in 2013, in which it gained around 15% of the popular vote. Now, let's say we can convert that into, seats. It obtained 115, 116 seats in the National Assembly in this round of elections. And, with that, let's say 25% of the popular vote, maybe it would have gotten around 70 to 80. In between, March and the elections, we had a series of events, most notably the disqualification of Nawaz Sharif for life from holding elected office. And as Moeed had said, that had produced an attitudinal change in the voter in Punjab. But with that said, this was a very competitive race. We had these two different narratives of service delivery in terms of social service delivery versus infrastructure development. In central Punjab, where the PMLN is based, it maintained support of its core constituency, but it lost pretty much elsewhere. The army obviously played a role in terms of shaping the electoral battlefield and making it more vulnerable to an influx of the PTI. But with that said, this was a formidable election in which there was a significant amount of competition, and much of Imran Khan's or PTI's performance had to do with the perception of the party as much better in terms of delivering on social services.
Yeah, thank you. I'm seeing two seats down here. Anyone who's standing, there's a seat right in the second row and in the third row. Thank you. Okay. We'll also look at the past in a way with the next question. Imran Khan has been in politics for about 20 years. And naturally, you leave a trail. And he certainly has. And so I'm going to ask the panel, to what extent will Imran Khan's past burden him as he looks to govern? Who'd like to start us off? Moe?
I could say a couple of things. So I think, look, I mean, when you've been in politics for this long, you are going to be constrained by what you've done. In PTI's case, I think there are one or two things that are very positive in terms of their ability to govern. One, despite being in politics for this long, I have not come across a Pakistani that challenges Imran on the financial, sort of the corruption element of it. I think he's seen as largely clean, philanthropic, etc. So he doesn't have the baggage that the status quo parties have in terms of being corrupt. The second one, which I think is equally, if not more important, one big thing Pakistan has struggled with and has to do if it wants to get its economy back on the rails is privatization of state enterprises. The reason previous governments have not been able to do it is that these enterprises are full of essentially their cadres who were inducted not on merit. And so they have lobbies and they are beholden to that. PTI does not have that problem yet at the top. At the, in the middle tiers, they've got a lot of electables, but I think they would find it easier. The two big challenges for Imran is one, overwhelming majority of his senior office bearers have not served in government before. So there's a learning curve when it comes to working with the bureaucracy, and they'll have to overcome that as quickly as they can. And if anybody's worked with the Pakistani bureaucracy, you know that's not fun. And the second constraint, quite frankly, is that the structure remains the same. The paradigm under which Pakistan operates hasn't changed. And any political leader will ultimately have to figure out how to increase the size of the national pie economically. And that's very difficult with the structures that you're providing.
Yes, Arif.
The question was about the past views. So I think, in terms of Imran Khan's past views, I don't see them as a significant constraint on his future behavior. If we look at the PTI of today compared to the PTI of 2013 or the PTI of the 1990s, it's a markedly different party. So Imran Khan entered Pakistani politics as a figure who, as a transformative figure, somebody who was railing against the system. Now, who are the members of his party today? It's largely people who were members of other political parties, last year. So he brought in all these different electables. His party has a very tentative alliance agreement with the Muttahida Qawmi movement, the MQMP. They were probably, they were essentially sworn enemies before that. So his, his voter base, I think they're they have a high level of tolerance for some sort of malleability. Even, during the course of the campaign, we saw Imran Khan adopt a tone that wasn't really consistent with the Imran Khan that we've seen over the decades. So, the use of religion as a means to attack his opponents. We've never seen Imran Khan do that. PTI has actually probably been a bit more progressive when it comes to the Ahmadi issue and some of its, campaign material and all that. So he's a malleable political actor. He's decided to work within the system, embrace a lot of the rules and the norms of the system, and the voters are going to be pragmatic. If people here can kind of adjust to the daily insanities of a Donald Trump presidency, I think we can have similar behavior in terms of the Pakistani electorate as well.
Maybe you've adjusted.
Maybe.
Michael?
I would argue that it's not necessarily his views that could be problematic for him as he tries to govern, but the tone that he'd used when he was, before his party was in power. I mean, there had been some pretty personal targeting of other parties, and I think this could simply mean that the political opposition could be very challenging for him. It could put up a big challenge to what he and his party may try to do in terms of carrying out its agenda.
Thank you.
I mean, I don't think there's a lot more to be said, but I think two things. One, his electoral base, I don't think is interested in ideological orthodoxy. I don't think they're looking for that from him. Similar to maybe President Trump's base here is not looking for orthodoxy in terms of the type of rhetoric that he's giving. And I think you can see that very clearly. The rhetoric that he used during the campaign is very different from even the rhetoric in his acceptance speech right after he won the election. Right after he won the election, it's much more of an accepting rhetoric and much less accusatory rhetoric. I think what is important, what his base is looking for, is what we alluded to earlier, which is this idea of change from the past, a Naya Pakistan, a new Pakistan. So as long as he can couch whatever he does, even if it's same old political hat, he needs to be able to couch it in this idea that it's non-corrupt, that it's leading Pakistan towards a new direction. And I think he's pretty good at taking any even very expedient move and couching it within those terms.
You know, I'm not hearing anyone bring up specifically the blasphemy law.
Actually, I was going to say something to Arif's comment and tag
Yeah,
it with
go
that.
ahead.
I actually don't think it's fair to say that PTI has been more liberal on this count. I actually think PPP's legislations and PMLN's in the last 2 years, in fact, PMLN got into serious trouble because of that. So I actually think they tried, but the lesson Imran's going to learn from that is don't go that way. Right?
Okay, okay.
But at the same time, you do have members of the PPP, especially in central Punjab, who have allied, had seat adjustments with
And PMLN and PTI.
Not,
I mean,
not
that's the,
PTI, because it just maybe didn't have the opportunity.
the Punjab electables who is picked up.
I'm saying in previous election cycles.
Yeah, but previous elections, they weren't players. I mean, this is the first time they've
That's
come
my
in.
point.
That's Pakistani politics. You want to win elections, you're going to do this.
Right.
You know, I also didn't hear a reference to his sympathetic statements about the Taliban, and his far less than sympathetic feeling toward the United States and its operations in Afghanistan. But we're going to get back to that,
Yeah,
because a later question that I have will touch on that. So now we've really been at the edges of this already. What's going to hold? Let's assume now he really does, with good reason to believe, want to make change. What's going to constrain him? What domestic factors are going to constrain him from really being transformative? Because I think that's what a lot of people are expecting.
Sure. I mean, I think first and foremost, he's facing an economic crisis. He has, I think the latest estimates were less than 2 months of import coverage. The rupee's falling. I think, the economic crisis that's looming, and whether he has to make a deal with the IMF or pay back some of the loans to China, I think that is going to constrain his ability to do a lot of the populist things that he wants to do economically. He has to deal with this first. Second of all, I think the political institutions and the political structure remains the same, and especially since he has relied so heavily on electables, they have the same constituents that want jobs, that want placements, that want money from the center, and especially now that with PMLQ, if he's able to, and the independents form a government in Punjab, I think that only reifies the need to give out constituent-based goodies, both from the center and in the provinces. If he's going to form a government in KPK, in Balochistan, and Punjab, those systems are very entrenched, and breaking them with people who are dependent on those systems, I think is almost impossible.
I also think if you just look at the sheer numbers, he's struggling to get a majority in the National Assembly. He's had to bring in the MQM. They were an option of last resort. If we look at the MQM's behavior in terms of how it's behaved as part of a coalition, it probably left the coalition with the PPP maybe 20, 30 times from the 2008 to 2013 period. You'd have phone calls by Altaf Hussain at 4 o'clock in the morning Karachi time, threatening to leave the government. Then he'd rejoin when the sun rises or when the sun rose. And I think Imran will he will face a perpetual threat of a vote of no confidence. So he's just going to get above the 50% margin. Maybe after by-elections, he may not need the MQM as a coalition partner, but he'll be skating on thin ice probably for the duration of his tenure. And so, for example, if he wants to privatize the national airline or the Pakistan steel mills, you can surely expect that the Pakistan People's Party, which has stuffed its party workers into those organizations, bleeding them of cash, that they'll be out on the streets protesting, that when Imran proposes this idea before the National Assembly, that they'll be banging their tables and protesting. So in terms of a reform agenda, he's not only going to have to rail against a system that is built against him and his inclinations and his dearth of experience, but also just the numbers game is not really in his favor.
Michael?
Yeah, I think this has been said before, but we have to emphasize the inexperience factor. I mean, again, this is a leader that has never held national power. The party has never held national power. And certainly the PTI does have a number of experienced folks high in the ranks who have served in the major parties. But I think one of the big questions is, how will Khan manage the inexperience, his inexperience and the party's inexperience? Will he try to bring in new folks who had not been with the PTI, hoping that he could help them with these very bold, ambitious objectives he has? Or will he be stubborn and not? So I think that could sort of determine how far he can go with this reform agenda.
I just want to focus, I mean, there are many. I touched on the inexperience and the structural problems, but what I really want to highlight, I think, is going to be Imran's number one problem, and others have alluded to this. That's the political opposition, the management of the opposition. One, I think Imran did himself a big disservice. I remember telling people when he was sitting in the dharnas, the protests, and sort of, speaking every night, that those very words will be used against him when he's in power. And so the first thing he has to get over is the cloud that the election was manipulated. How well he does that, I think we have to wait and see. The way to do that is to allow opening up of all constituencies that the opposition says were manipulated and get that out of the way. Otherwise, it's going to be the Nawaz Sharif problem, which kept coming back to him. Second, he doesn't have control of the Senate. And in Pakistan, if you want to make sweeping changes in terms of legislation, the Senate is crucial. He's not going to have control over the next 2 years, but then even after 2 years, because of the Punjab performance of the PMLN, he's not going to have a clear run on that. So he has to work across the aisle to make that happen. And therein, I think, lies Imran's big problem. He has come across as, and is, very judgmental about his political opponents. I think it's based on his view of whether somebody's clean or not financially and otherwise. But for instance, if you want to deliver Karachi, which is Pakistan's biggest city and has been in ruins, quite frankly, for so long, you need to work with the PPP, not MQM, because they're the ones who are going to form government there. Can he not? I think those are the real questions that are going to hold him back if he can pull that off. The final thing I want to say is, I want to disagree with Tamanna on this, in fact, disagree with this whole town, because this is the only conversation here right now, apart from the elections and manipulation, whatever. Economic crisis, Pakistan about to fail. Look at 2007, 8, when the government changed. Look at 2013. Same story every time, because Pakistan has a structural economic problem that's cyclical. It brings it to the same exact point every 5 years. And then it takes off and then it comes back. They need to fix those structural problems. But the fundamentals of the economy are much stronger today than they were in 2013 when Nawaz Sharif took over. So if they can get through the short-term crisis, which is not easy, but they will, then I don't think this is the make or break for Imran at the end of the day.
Yeah. go ahead.
And I agree with you that it's not going to cause a crisis of failure for the country, but I do think that it's a huge attention suck for Imran Khan. Without experience, having to actually muddle through the economic crisis will just take up a lot of their time. One interesting point on the opposition, I think if people watched the All Parties Conference this week, it was very interesting. If the opposition can actually, if PPP and the MMA parties and PMLN can actually stay organized as they are saying they're going to be united in terms of contesting seats and being not a loyal opposition, then he will have a lot to deal with. But I don't know if they actually will be able to stay as organized as they are right now. Right now, they appear to be this one very interesting block. I mean, if you look at that conference, it's so interesting to watch Sher Rahman with, PMLN. You have all these PMLN folks with her and Jamaat-e-Islami and JUIF, but they've worked together in the past, and that's the important thing. So they may be able to actually give Imran Khan quite a run.
I think it depends on PTI whether
Yeah.
they stay together or not. Less them, but more whether PTI can actually bring them to their side.
No one mentioned taxation. It's hard to imagine getting further in terms of the ability to control the economy, to get the deficits down and so on. In the past, taxation has really been the barrier here to getting the traditional politicians, at least, to have them on board for any kind of change. I understand that he has looked favorably at certain tax policies. Michael had a panel recently, but I've never seen him really say, I'm gonna tax all you folks out there who have done so well under the system, and unless we do so, I can't really have the kind of free hand that I'm going to need here to do a lot of things I want to do. Well, what's your take on that?
Well, I think many people here talk about taxation and Pakistan's loaded tax to GDP ratio, and that is an issue. But a country like Bangladesh has a much lower tax to GDP ratio. So the issue in Pakistan today is not necessarily taxation, but growth, and what type of economic growth are we seeing? The growth of the past 5 years has been import-based growth. It's been based on government spending and domestic consumption. Pakistan is a net energy importer, and that has contributed. The combination of the import of machinery and energy has resulted in this massive distortion in the economy. And as Mohit had said earlier, this is a cyclical problem. So whenever oil prices jump up, Pakistan faces these problems and then has to go to the Saudis and to the IMF for some sort of assistance. So the challenge here is to not just increase the tax to GDP ratio, but produce a framework for sustainable economic growth and to diversify and expand exports, which I think is very much possible. The problem is that in Pakistan from 2014 to 2017, exports actually dropped. And in Bangladesh and Vietnam, they just surged. Exports have gone up by around 10 to 13% in the past year. So there is an opportunity to boost textile exports and then expand to, let's say, meat, livestock, agriculture, which is going on. But it's far easier to make money in Pakistan using these captive commercial markets, domestic markets, rather than having to compete in a global economy. And that requires the maturation of domestic industry and harmonizing that with economic diplomacy that results in good and favorable FTAs. So that's the bigger challenge. I think we got to move beyond this.
Okay. Let me move on to the next question, if I might. It's general consensus, and there's a lot of evidence to back this up, that the military played a role. I think you've already alluded to that. Whether that was determined or not, we could debate. But rather than that, that notwithstanding, there's a good deal of feeling that ultimately Nawaz and what his goals are will come into conflict with the military. How do you see that?
So I would change the word conflict to tension, because I think Imran recognizes the compromise that has been made in terms of this outcome. People forget that it took Nawaz Sharif 20 years to do what he did in terms of the clash with the military. He started off as a very different person. I also want to be clear that I don't think we can compare Imran and Nawaz in terms of the start of their political career. I mean, Imran actually was an independent political actor who is popular because of other things. That said, I think there are two issues that we can't run away from. First of all is budget. This tension is going to happen. There is just no way around it. Pakistan does not have enough money to pay its dues domestically or externally. The military budget has gone up by $1 billion in the last budget, which is now, of course, going to be revised by this government. That has gone up partly because the US assistance has gone down and the military still requires the money for counterterrorism, etc. That's going to be the number one question within the next few months. How they handle that, is going to be one indicator. The second one is a larger structural question. If you want to do what Arif just said, one of the big impediments to growth is lack of regional connectivity in the region. We are seeing north-south connectivity, we're still not seeing east-west connectivity, and the reasons are clear. Nawaz Sharif clashed on that as well. Whether Imran Khan would go in that direction or hold back, we'll have to wait and see. But if you want to unleash Pakistan's total economic potential constructively, sooner or later that has to happen. How he plays that, we'll have to wait and see.
Michael.
Yes, I think this is a hard question to answer, because Khan is, of course, somewhat unpredictable, and it's hard to really figure out what's going to happen. But I'd highlight two core considerations here that I think make this particularly difficult to address. One, what we hear about him is that he's not one to defer to higher authority, suggesting that he may want to push back against the army, and the army may not like that, and then you could have problems. But on the other hand, this is someone that has sought the prime ministership for quite some time, and so that suggests that if he finally has it, why would he want to jeopardize his hold on power by getting into a fight with the army? And one more thing to highlight is that I do think that on many issues, particularly foreign policy issues, Khan and the army really do see eye to eye. You could argue there could be a few exceptions here or there, which I could go into later. But this suggests that if they are going to clash, it may be more likely that they would clash over broader structural factors, such as Khan wanting more space than the army is willing to give him, more so than conflicts or tensions over specific policy issues.
Arif?
I think I think we tend to see Imran Khan as an impulsive actor, somebody who speaks from the heart and rails against the system and then clashes with everybody, but everybody else, including potentially the army. But I think what we've seen in this year in particular is that Imran has finally become a politician. So he's he's engaged in rhetoric and behavior that is uncharacteristic. And if you compare his campaign rhetoric to his post-victory speech, he turned it off. He turned that vessel or whatever metaphor you want to use, he turned it off and he pivoted back to a more inclusive message. And so I think he understands, as Michael had said, that this is that opportunity he was looking for, and there are plenty of there's plenty of precedent in Pakistan of a civilian politician picking a fight with the army and then kind of losing everything and ending up in Adiala prison. So I think he's learned from that.
I think the military also knew what it's getting into. They've been watching Imran Khan for 20 years, just as we have. So I don't think they are under any illusions that he is completely controllable in that way. But I think it's important what Marvin and others and Michael said, that many of the foreign policy issues that are most important to the army, Imran Khan is largely either in accord with them, or he doesn't really care that much. For example, on India, he said some very nice things in his post-victory speech, but I don't think that's necessarily at the top of his list. If he is interested in this Naya Pakistan about rooting out corruption and trying to improve some sort of domestic governance and security domestically, those are things the military can get behind, at least rhetorically. And it is something that they like for the government, the civilian government, to focus on. So as long as he doesn't touch the money that is going to the military, I think Moeed's point is very important. So when U.S. security assistance never went directly to the military. The military was already paid by the Treasury, and the money goes back to the Treasury. So the military is still cashing in whatever they need from the Treasury. It's going to be up to Imran Khan can they continue to fund that? But I think that's a last resort. They can cut other things. In his speech, he talks about all this ostentatious display that the civilian governments do, the Prime Minister House or some governor's houses, these things. So if he starts off small on these things, I don't think the military would be happy with those. And it's the very last thing probably that he would look at touching would be the military's budget, unless he has a lot of courage.
Yeah. I agree with it. I don't think it's that simple, though, because, look, when you're sitting outside of government, some of the things you don't really care about. I think the analytical question to answer is, how much of Pakistan's foreign relations matter to what a prime minister needs to do to get the economy back on the rails? If the answer is not much, then I think it's fine. If the answer is it's intrinsically linked, then it's not about Imran realizing that he has to play ball or pull back. It is more about a prime minister who desperately wants to deliver and finds out that he can't without doing certain things. I think that's really the question he has to answer in his own way. I will say, though, Arif, that I think there could be another way to look at Imran Khan's last year and speech. And I think I can say this with a little bit of confidence, just knowing. I think a lot of people were telling him, just
Dial it back.
take it easy. Take it easy. Let's get to power, and we have our agenda, and we will follow it. And his agenda, quite frankly, is a clear one, where he wants to do certain things. He's big on human development, as his track record says. The problem is Pakistan doesn't have money. I was just talking to somebody yesterday who'd mentioned this. If you take away the structural costs, current account, defense, debt, etc., you're talking of $34 per capita for everything else. That's $3 per capita a month. You just can't bring a new country, or Naya Pakistan, or old Pakistan, or whatever it is, with that. That's the structural problem we have to address. Musharraf addressed it by increasing the size of the pie, right? Can he do that or not? That's the real question.
I think there's one other thing, Marvin.
Yeah.
Yes, that's if I agree with Moeed in terms of if substantively Imran Khan is actually focused on fixing the economy, which I think he's going to have to be. But also in terms of his personality, he has been trying to be prime minister for so long. Now, will he come to the realization that he is a neutered prime minister, that he is not able to just do what he wants on foreign policy? I think that also may be a psychological impact on him. At some point, he's going to want to be a prime minister with full power to do and say what he wants to do. I think that unpredictability might get him into trouble. You know, if he wants to go and meet with the U.S. or meet with the Afghan leaders and promise something, and he's not backed up by the military, what happens then in that conflict? Does he back down, or does he continue to push forward as the leader of Pakistan?
That's the perfect segue to the next question, which is how important is personality? We've always thought of him as a different kind. Now, he may very well begin to accommodate himself to the normal political leadership. But we haven't seen in Pakistan a charismatic, reform-minded prime minister like we first saw in Zulfikar Ali Bhutto when he came to power in 1971. And he did shake up things, for a while at least. He did shake up things. So does someone who has these qualities, which have been relatively rare, can that person do things just because they are less predictable, because they say, we would call them populists, I guess. They say, well, I can do this because I have the people behind me. And that election spread, even though putting together a government is still difficult, that election spread shows that I do have a popular mandate. Feelings about this?
I mean, I think if you look at the way PTI is governed in KPK, there wasn't an attempt to kind of, introduce a revolutionary spirit. There was, a very low bar, basic building blocks of governance, social service delivery, improving education, reforming the police, improving healthcare. And so if that model worked, in their own campaign commercials, they highlighted those issues. And then, at the end, the tagline was, if this could happen in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, then it could happen in Pakistan. And that was their slogan. That was their selling point. And so, I expect that to largely animate how it approaches the issue of governance, and also given the fact that most of the people who are part of his party are now people who reflect many of the shortcomings of the political culture and system in the country. He's going to have to go against those guys as well. So that's a factor that reduces his transformative capabilities.
Michael?
I mean, just on the positive side, I mean, if he does continue this type of populist stand in government, I think that until and unless there's a problem, he could make civilian politics and civilian leadership hip and cool again, in the eyes of those that support him, of course. I say that with that qualification. That's one thing to throw out there.
Okay. Did you want to add anything?
No, I think I
Okay.
covered that.
Marvin, could I add a couple of things?
Yeah.
This would surprise most people. I actually don't think Imran is a populist.
Okay.
I think he's popular, but he's not a populist. And the reason I say that is, this was his only way to break into the system. But if you look at what he stands for, it's fairly mainstream human development issues that he's very passionate about. When he talks about overhauling the system, he's not a Trump or a Modi or a Macron or a Brexit. I think he's basically mainstream with a very popular streak in him because of his background. One thing we should put on the table, and again, it's going to sound contradictory. I think in the moment of the election, we shouldn't forget that the previous government actually did a lot of things that worked. It wasn't a disaster. I mean, the last year has kind of wiped out everything, but they actually did put a lot of things in order. The question is whether Imran's personality will be able to break from a Pakistani tradition, which is first you nullify and undermine every single thing that the previous administration did and then start anew. I think it will be crucial for Imran to build on what's done right and only fix what's not. And I don't know where his personality stands on that. He has a leg up because I will tell you, people in Pakistan generally, I find, optimistic about this change, whether they were PTI supporters or not. And the answer is a very typically Pakistani one, somebody different, right? So he's got a leg up. People are willing to give him that space. Whether he captures that or not, we'll have to wait and see.
Okay. I'm sure many here have been waiting for a question about the United States and this new regime. So let me turn that. What does the election then mean for U.S.-Pakistan affairs?
I'm sure many of you guys saw the New York Times cover where it was, I don't even remember it, but it was a doomsday cover, right? That Imran Khan is bringing the terrorists and it's the end of U.S.-Pakistan relations, something like that. I mean, I don't believe in any of that. One, because he doesn't control the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. Two, because the U.S.-Pakistan relationship is already pretty bad, right? So it's not that his election is somehow going to bring it to its knees. I think it will be interesting to see how and if the U.S. administration even pays attention or engages with Imran Khan. I think that will be our first test. Even the State Department's acknowledgement of the election was very muted, very, said that the election basically happened. Nothing about Imran Khan. There is not, to my knowledge, any congratulations or anything like that. I think the U.S.-Pakistan relationship right now is suffering from both sides in terms of not because of any real actions, but because of, I think the cycle has come to the point, the up and down of the U.S.-Pakistan relationship is at its bottom right now, and it is also because lack of action. There isn't the security assistance. There isn't as much need for interaction on counterterrorism or on Afghanistan. Even in terms of when I think we're going to get to peace talks in Afghanistan, with the U.S. trying this new initiative to reach out to the Afghan Taliban and restart Afghan peace talks, it's really without the involvement of Pakistan. It is not as in 2015 or 2016, there was some type of embrace of Pakistan into it. So unless that significantly changes, I don't see that Imran Khan is going to, get involved so much. Secondly, I think the military really, this is one relationship that they control and they want to continue to control. I think the rhetoric that Imran Khan uses is actually to their benefit. The U.S. side, whenever they engage with the U.S. military, or with the Pakistani military, often the Pakistani military uses an anti-U.S. sentiment. Look, the people are so anti-U.S., we couldn't cooperate with you because look at the polls, look at the politicians, they're all against the U.S. So even if we wanted to, we couldn't do that for you. And I think Imran Khan his rhetoric, if continued in the same way, could be beneficial for the military. So I don't see it necessarily improving the relationship, but it's not necessarily going to make it much worse.
Michael.
Yeah, I agree with Tamana entirely. I mean, Imran himself is not going to be the main factor in determining the trajectory of a relationship that's already in bad shape and will probably not improve in major ways anytime soon. I think one thing to highlight as a concern for the U.S.-Pakistan relationship with Khan in power is if there were to be some type of triggering event, say a drone strike. There aren't as many drone strikes as there used to be, but say there's a drone strike, or even less likely, say there's some type of U.S. unilateral raid into Pakistan to apprehend a terrorist. Something like that could give Khan the opportunity to tap into some of these the term we're using, populist, tap into that type of language, which could then, galvanize folks, bring people into the streets, and I think that could perhaps be a concern. And the other thing, sort of thinking outside the box, one thing I've been struck by, I've done a fair amount of research on the Pakistani-American diaspora. I have not done research specifically on their political preferences, but anecdotally, through a number of conversations with Pakistani Americans over the years, I find that a very large number of them are PTI supporters. And you hear that diasporas can be a bridge over the troubled waters of diplomacy, whatever the case may be. So perhaps that could be something to think about in the context of a relationship that's not going to be getting better anytime soon. Is there something to be said for what a diaspora community that seems to be very much quite a few supporters, funders of the PTI, what role they could play in the relationship?
No. We brought up Afghanistan here. And it's true, as you say, that the U.S. has not, but certainly Pakistan ultimately is going to want to be heard. It's not going to sit by idly, I would think, and watch the United States reach, and the Kabul government certainly, reach some agreement where Pakistan thought its own interests were not being, if not served, at least being understood. And more specifically, and here we're going back to the past, he has given the sympathetic view that he's had about the Taliban. Michael has argued in writing that this could actually facilitate, this could be positive. On the other hand, we've already indicated here that there is here an audience here that is prone to see the United States as being in the wrong in Afghanistan and cahoots with the Indians. So I think we're all concerned about, as the U.S. looks for new initiatives in Afghanistan, can Pakistan help, or is it likely to be a spoiler?
I think that's a very good question. I've long argued that reconciliation or a peace process in Afghanistan is actually probably the best way to resolve the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. While Afghanistan remains a huge military and other counterterrorism commitment for the United States, it's almost impossible to normalize our relationship with Pakistan. In terms of looking at a peace process, the United States, I think, and I would argue that the Bush administration and the Obama administration and the current Trump administration largely see it in similar terms, that the very center of the conflict is the Afghan government, the Taliban, and the United States. But they see Pakistan as as an important, I would not even say a full concentric circle out, but half a concentric circle out. So, everyone talks about Pakistan's safe havens for the Afghan Taliban. That is a core issue in any peace process or any resolution of this conflict. So if you are actually trying to get to peace talks with the Afghan Taliban, there are two things which any U.S. administration, and I think this one as well, is looking for. One is to get the Pakistani government to have better relations with the Afghan government. And number two is for the Pakistani government to at least bless or allow the Taliban in some way, to show some support to the Taliban to engage in peace negotiations. Now, you can define these at different times differently, given the relationship between the Pakistani government and the Taliban's success and internal safe haven in Afghanistan, but I think those two things remain largely the same. And how can Imran Khan play in either of those? I think in terms of his pro-Taliban sentiments, to me, they've been largely generic. I mean, he doesn't even differentiate. I mean, he does sometimes between the Pakistani Taliban and the Afghan Taliban, but I would argue he doesn't necessarily have a real relationship with the Afghan Taliban in any real way. But the sentiments can be helpful in generating public support for a peace process if used the right way. I think the Pakistani military will decide how best to use that sentiment. It will be in their court whether to use that sentiment to further peace talks that the United States is involved in or to hold them back. But I think where Imran Khan might have a more positive influence is actually in terms of the relationship with the Afghan government. It's important to remember that Ashraf Ghani is going to come into elections very soon. This summer there's supposed to be parliamentary elections, and then next summer they're going to be highly, I think, contentious.
Actually, October
yes.
and April.
April, right. So next year we're going to have Ashraf Ghani coming into election. So I think in that period, there's going to, the politicking has already started in Kabul. But if Imran Khan can, in his charismatic way, at least reach out to Ashraf Ghani, I think you may get some bounce in relationships. What we've seen is in the beginning of an administration, either in Islamabad or in Kabul, they give them a little bit of space for a good relationship, and then it usually goes downhill. But with a new leader, there is some room to improve relationships.
And Tamanna had noted two factors that are crucial for Pakistan to contribute to some degree of stability in Afghanistan, and they were endorsement to some degree of a reconciliation process, and then also improving relations with the Afghan government. And for much of since last October, there's been a process known by the acronym of APAPS, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and then there's a lot of other stuff in there. But it's a bilateral process between the Afghan and Pakistani governments in which they engage on a broad a set of issues: economic trade, security cooperation, ending so-called safe havens, border management, border security. And a lot of these issues are actually a part of a set of demands that we've seen from both the civilian and military actors inside Pakistan. So it represents some degree of reconciling of the Afghans, that they have to address some of the long-standing demands of the Pakistani government and their view of what an eventual broader peace settlement might look like. So that's been going on despite some of the tweets we've been seeing from the president and some of these other processes that have been going on. And then I think the Pakistani Foreign Office, which I think we can safely say is issuing statements that also reflect a civil-military consensus, has on numerous occasions in the past year has not only endorsed reconciliation in Afghanistan, but has also called on the Afghan Taliban to do that. So, and what we've seen is in the interim government period and in the tail end of the previous government, when Shahid Khaqan Abbasi was the prime minister, that process has kind of continued on autopilot. And so, to some extent, it might not even matter who's in power.
I mean, I would just two-finger on that. I would agree fully that when we have been in place, like in 2015 during the Murray talks, or in 2016 when we had QCGs with China and Afghanistan and Pakistan, when we were the most invested in actually talking to Pakistan, it was not with the civilian leadership. It was with the Foreign Office, with the Foreign Secretary leading those meetings and talks, and with the military and ISI. I mean, those are the players that will be most involved in this. I mean, obviously, it's nice if the Prime Minister supports these things, but largely the Prime Minister's office stays silent on these issues. So I don't think even his pro-Taliban or anti-Taliban rhetoric would change much.
Unless Imran Khan is different.
Unless Imran Khan is very different, but I think if he goes, and that is something, if he goes against the military quite stridently there, I think that would be something they would care about. If he supports them, then no problem.
I actually think Afghanistan is one issue on which the Pakistani civil-military divide doesn't exist.
Yeah.
I think there's a consensus across the board that, rightly or wrongly, number one, the end point has to be a political settlement in which the Taliban are involved. Now, what that means, one can debate. Second, that the US is a net negative force since 9/11, but still should not leave tomorrow, otherwise things will fall apart. And third, that ultimately it's about India, Pakistan, not Afghanistan, that's going to, put Pakistan in place. I think there's no disagreement on that. I also would discount the new Prime Minister getting space kind of argument, because Nawaz was fairly forward-leaning on Afghanistan and India. I don't think Imran's going to be more forward-leaning than that, even if he's new in office. So, the larger point here, Marvin, I think, is we need to watch for two things very closely. Who is Imran's foreign minister? It'll give you a very good sense of what kind of interaction he's going to have with the military. And second, how well does Imran use the National Security Council, which Shahid Khaqan Abbasi used very well, Nawaz Sharif disregarded for his 4 years. Because if they don't use that, there is no other institutional mechanism where the civilians and military can come together to agree on something. Now, we can have the romanticism of civilian supremacy, this and that. It's not going to happen. Not tomorrow, not next year. So I think these are the two indicators to me. Who's the foreign minister? First of all, I really hope there is a foreign minister, unlike
Yeah,
before.
well, right, yeah.
Who's the foreign minister? And second, how is the National Security Council used for these? And Afghanistan and US are the two big accounts in that.
Anything else? So let's have the last question here. We just once mentioned India. Is anything likely to happen? Anything different that we have not seen? To what extent is he invested at all? He did say something reasonably warm, and I understand that Modi has contacted him, and that was positive. But on the other hand, Nawaz Sharif was associated with looking for ways forward with India. Does he bring anything else to the table?
Okay. Yeah, I don't think we should. I think we should keep our expectations low. Certainly, it's tempting to be optimistic because of what he said, and of course, he has a lot of Indian cricket friends and Bollywood friends and so forth. So there, you have those types of links. But no. I mean, first of all, like the policy toward the U.S., it's the Army that controls the India portfolio. And I would actually argue that, setting aside this conciliatory rhetoric, I mean, Khan really sees eye to eye, in my view, with the Army when it comes to India. And I also think his views are not conducive to an improvement in relations. I mean, for one thing, Khan has been very emphatic on the need to resolve the Kashmir dispute. And of course, India, or at least the current government in India, does not want to go there. So, if Khan were to extend an olive branch to India, India could well suspect that that means that it's a ploy to get India to discuss an issue, the Kashmir issue, that the current government in India, at least at this point, doesn't seem to want to discuss. And I don't see that changing, particularly with an election coming up next year in India. And also, the other big issue is the presence of Lashkar-e-Taiba and groups like that in Pakistan. I don't see Imran Khan being the guy to push the army to do something about that. We saw what happened with Nawaz Sharif. So maybe the best thing we could hope for, perhaps, is for some of these cultural relations that are really frayed, these people-to-people relations that have really suffered over the last year or so between India and Pakistan, maybe there you could see some progress if Khan again could draw on these many ties that he has to India in show business and the cricket world. But otherwise, I think we should keep our expectations modest.
So, as you know, this is on my mind because I've just done a book on India-Pakistan crises and US role, etc. I'm very, very pessimistic, and I think the best case scenario is to avoid a major crisis in the next 5 years. I think we shouldn't go beyond that, quite frankly. You have a situation where Pakistan has now become part of Indian domestic politics all over again. India was not mentioned in Pakistani elections in 2008 or 13, but again, because of the conversations, that's back. I think you've had an army chief in Pakistan who actually did want to reset some of the things and failed, which also says there are structural problems. And ultimately, I think even if you were to bring the most pro-India guy in Pakistan and pro-Pakistan guy in India right now, the structure of the relationship is such that I think you're going to have very little movement. So to me, captive to my own book, but my argument would be if we can manage the LOC in a way that there isn't another major crisis, we've done pretty well there.
Yeah.
I wholeheartedly agree on all of those, but I would just also point to the fact that if you look at the last elections in 2013, what was the situation in Jammu and Kashmir, in the valley on the Indian side? It was relatively peaceful. You had you had a lot of tourism, things were pretty open, and now fast forward to now, and you have the last few summers of high levels of military action, militant action, you have curfews nonstop, and so you have a valley that is smoldering. At the same time, Imran Khan is immensely popular in Jammu and Kashmir, on the Indian side, because of his cricket days. I mean, I was there not long ago, and there's posters of him everywhere. So he is immensely popular, and that is not necessarily helpful. I would argue that actually just adds to the powder keg.
It's a crisis
that
in
is
the making.
Yes, it's a crisis in the making, and he could inadvertently stumble into a crisis because there are so many mines all over the place right now. So I think it's actually it's worse time than 2013 for that.
Well, on that sober note, let's have the audience have its chance here. As I recognize you, I'm going to take two at a time. As I recognize you, please keep that question short. Probably little or no commentary, if you will, and identify yourself. So let's start out. This gentleman over here, and go ahead. And please wait for the microphone. Of course, we are being streamed, and we've got two other set of cameras back here. So speak up and speak into the mic.
Thank you. Hello? Thank you. My name is Jay Kansara. I'm with the Hindu American Foundation. And earlier this year, the Trump administration, particularly through Secretary of State Rex Tillerson at the time, had designated Pakistan on a special watch list with regards to religious freedom violations. And they said in their official statement that a country of particular concern designation could be given at any time because the conditions so warrant that. Can any of the panelists, I guess, pontificate on should the United States actually follow through on its, ministerial plan, which was released last week at the State Department to advance religious freedom, if they do actually, implement a CPC designation, and what that could mean for the relationship, especially with sanctions that should be levied?
Okay. Let's have a second. This gal right here.
Hello, thank you. My name is Malale Habibi. I'm from Afghanistan. I'm here doing my Master of Global Affairs, International Peace Studies within the Notre Dame University. After 70 years, now the U.S. seeking a political negotiated settlement in Afghanistan. There is said to be some bilateral negotiation between the U.S. and the Taliban without having the Afghanistan government around the negotiation table. If this negotiation isn't going to be Afghan-led and Afghan-owned, so what do you think the role of Pakistan in this negotiation is? And can Pakistan, with Imran Khan as the Prime Minister, the one who expressed his sympathy for the Afghan Taliban, be the third angle of this negotiation between the Taliban and the U.S.?
Okay. All right, we have two questions, one on Afghanistan and the other on religious freedom. Any thoughts here?
I can take
Afghanistan.
one.
Yeah.
I'll do the one on Afghanistan. Thank you. I think, since 2009, the policy of the U.S. government has been no preconditions to talks with the Taliban as long as the Afghan government was supportive. And so while I'm not in government now, the practice of the U.S. government has always been to bring the Afghan government on board. So while they have said that they would engage in talks directly with the Taliban without the Afghan government in the room, that does not mean that the Afghan government is not involved. So whether they are, they would be consulted before and after and closely aligned with the Afghan government. I think it's very clear the Trump administration has said very many times that their allies in the Afghan government, they are not selling them out. They're going to be very close to them. I don't think there's any room for the Pakistani government at the table if it was just the U.S. and Taliban. And even if it was the U.S., Taliban, and the Afghan government in that negotiation, it has never been the sense of any of the U.S. administrations that the Pakistanis would have a seat directly at that table, but it may be that the Pakistanis would have some consultative role, as other parties in the region have been consulted, including China and others who have an interest in Afghanistan. So I don't think that this new set of talks or this new initiative is done without consultation and alignment with the Afghan government. And I think the Pakistani government would never be in the room if it was just the U.S. and the Taliban.
But Tamana, you would agree that they may not have to be if
Yes.
if the Taliban representatives are people who they trust.
Sure.
And who
sure.
might.
I mean, I think that is always a concern. I think it is One school of thought portrays the Afghan Taliban as completely independent, completely domestic with no influence from Pakistan, and the other, which often the Afghan government does, as a puppet of the Pakistani state. I think neither is true. It's somewhere in the middle. There is definitely influence. There is a lot of there are some Taliban who are closer to the Pakistani state and establishment than other Taliban, but I would also argue that the Afghan Taliban have an internal safe haven. They are not any longer financially or even in terms of safe haven completely dependent on the Pakistani state. There's very much a love-hate relationship there. So as much as the Pakistani state would like to influence the Taliban, I don't think they will be completely able to control the talks, and I think that is one reason why talks have happened outside of Pakistan, such as in Qatar and other places. Talks that have happened in Pakistan, like the Murray talks, have often been with Taliban who are much closer to the Pakistani state and have not been as fruitful.
Arvind, can I just add? I think there is absolutely no risk of the Taliban negotiating on Pakistan's behalf. I think the Taliban's history does not sort of add up to that.
No.
In fact, I actually would argue that Pakistan's worry that it can't voice is that it feels that the Taliban are essentially going to do what they want to do, whether it's in Pakistan's interests or not. So I think we make too much of this Pakistan-Taliban relationship.
No, I do agree with you on that. This religious, the question really is American policy. Does Imran Khan have any views that we know toward minorities which would make him any different than his predecessors?
I don't know. I mean, I am not qualified to answer. I don't know. I'm not sure.
Any thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, he's gone back and forth. I mean, he's condemned terrorist attacks on sectarian targets. He's condemned attacks by the Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, which is staged attacks on Shias, among others. But of course, we all also heard what he had said about the blasphemy laws during the election campaign. So it's just hard to say. He's hard to.
I also think the designation of a state of concern in terms of religious freedom has happened in the past. They've gone on and off watch lists. You could argue that almost any point in the last 20 years of Pakistani history, you could find cases that qualify Pakistan to be on the list. Often the sanctions are imposed as political will as they are not. So I think it's less emblematic of the status of minorities getting worse. I think they are bad in Pakistan, but it's not that there's been a huge delta. I think it is the status of U.S.-Pakistan relationship getting worse. So I would look at that designation on a watch list as a symbol of that. And if they choose to take the sanctions route, then it is further exacerbation of a
Let's
bad
have two more questions now, right here on the aisle, if you will.
Hi, my name is Abdullah Wasti, and I'm a graduate student in DC. So my question is regarding the pre-poll engineering and how this might normalize the military's behind-the-scene role to some extent, because some journalists have peddled this narrative that such managed continuity is better than overt military coups, and but with this narrative, do we run the risk of A, normalizing this behavior, and B, is it really managed continuity? Because in certain instances, we've seen the military not worrying about the optics and being very, very obvious in where its interests lie, be it the Faizabad incident, or when Prime Minister, well, not Prime Minister, Interior Minister Ahsan Iqbal was stopped from entering the courts. Don't such actions imply that the military will step in whenever it needs to, and
Okay,
otherwise it's fine?
Let's move
with
on
the
to
optics?
another question here. Any gals out there? Right down front here.
Hi, my name is Riyanka Shah. I previously assisted Mr. Kugelman at the Wilson Center. My question would be, do you see any significant changes between the Pakistan and China relationship under the Imran Khan government?
Pakistan and China. Yeah. Okay, quickly.
I can take the China one, just to say that it's now a compulsion. It's not a choice. It's gone too far. It's a compulsion for both. I have to say I do pick up quite a bit of cynicism in this town about it, and perhaps a little bit of sadistic pleasure when things start going wrong. I actually don't think it's good for either the US or Pakistan, because at the end of the day, the US is not in a position and is not willing to bail out Pakistan in the future, given the situation. For a country of Pakistan's size and nuclear weapons and all of that, you also don't want a situation where it's left ally-less, if you will, or friend-less. So I actually think whatever the problems, and there are going to be many problems in the China-Pakistan management of CPEC, it's such a huge project. At the end of the day, it's become a compulsion that both will have to work on, live with, and live through the problems that they face.
And I think the most important bilateral relationship Pakistan will actually have to manage is that with China, just because there are so many liabilities that are immediate. Yeah. And so we'll probably have to see the PTI-led government ask China to reschedule some of the short-term loans that they've taken in the past 18 months. And then a lot of these PPAs, these private power agreement, these power purchasing agreements, these electric power agreements will have to be renegotiated. The tariffs are just too high, and they're not conducive to Pakistan actually getting out of this cycle of an import-heavy economy. It needs to be able to to export, and to be able to compete with Bangladesh. You can't have electric power that's 50% more expensive. But there are also areas of strong convergence. So now we're going to have a government in power that is very keen on natural gas exploration. For very personal reasons, the previous government hesitated from doing so. That was totally against Pakistan's economic interests. And if they fast track some of those measures, then that can really boost Pakistan's economy, and I think we can have some sort of harmony in terms of a lot of this infrastructure development that's through CPEC, and then Pakistan being able to compete in the global market.
No takers on the first question?
On the rigging one?
Yeah, the rigging, the military is.
Oh, apparently not. So I'm going to move on. Okay.
Your question was if there's a new normal, right? In terms of the military.
Oh.
Behind the scenes role that they're playing.
Right. But the military is it's part of the system. When Shahbaz Sharif, before the elections, would frequently engage with whoever was the corps commander in Lahore, or send an emissary to GHQ, maybe it was Jawli Nassar sometimes. There was that behind the scenes engagement with the military. The military is inherent in the political process. It's a political party, it's a brotherhood of its own, and so we're seeing some heightening of that engagement, but maybe they will give Imran Khan some space. So I'm not sure if there's going to be a normalization of some of the that heightened activity we've seen in this election cycle. So that's something to watch out for.
Okay, two more questions then.
Arvind, can I make the most provocative statement of
Please.
the afternoon, if I could? I think what you've seen here, first of all, you may be too young for this, but the 90s was much more sort of synchronized in that way. But leave that aside. I think what you've really seen here is a very interesting paradox for Pakistan, which is that there was an individual who was more popular than his seat count said in elections for 20 years, who many people thought, whether PTI or not, that it's somebody different, somebody new, somebody clean, let's try. But the patronage-based politics gave him no way to get to the top. So he basically had to go to electables and play the same old game. That's one part of the paradox. You can't rise unless... The second part of the paradox is that everybody thought that the status quo parties will not be able to deliver. But there was no organic way of breaking that status quo. So you got a combination of somebody who had to compromise on electoral politics and somebody who decided it's time to try something new, come together. And that's how you have a new prime minister that's not status quo. Okay. That's just a paradox of Pakistani politics.
There, and then here.
Kamran Bukhari, Center for Global Policy. The quick question combining the domestic political situation and foreign policy. Essentially, to what extent, and this is a question for anybody who wants to take it, to what extent is there a domestic political compulsion to better the economy that would force Islamabad under Imran Khan to essentially approach India differently? I know that we've talked about the hurdles and whatnot. Mohit said that the relationship, if we can manage it, and prevent war, then that would be the best case scenario. But to what extent? Because this is thrown out a lot in the open sources. So I'd love to get your views on that.
Okay, and down here in the second row.
Excuse me, Malcolm O'Dell. I was at Faisalabad for some time. Question about minorities and women. How did women vote in this election? What's that mean? Number two, minorities. How is he likely to move about the blasphemy? He's made statements all in favor of the blasphemy laws, but is that likely to be just political, or is he going to move in a different direction?
I haven't seen any exit polls on women voting, but I did see some pre-election polls, and I think, at least in terms of the urban centers, women were more concerned about issues like inflation and the price of basic goods because they tend to manage the household budget. So I'm not sure how that impacted their voting. And then we also saw, greater turnout because of a new electoral law, I think passed last year, that required a minimum of the total voters to be at least a minimum of 10% of them to be women. So that will be something to watch out for in terms of future exit polls. They're likely going to be have been done by Gallup Pakistan. So I think we'll have to wait and see.
I think they're doing 2 constituencies. They're repolling because they didn't reach the 10% mark.
North Waziristan and then
There are 2, and then also I think what I've seen is a number of areas in the northwest and southern Punjab where women were not usually culturally going out to vote actually have voted this time, whether it's because the 10% or otherwise. So I think it's a net positive. Now I have a colleague at USIP and we always debate this. She comes from a very sort of elections monitoring background who says, well, but women were forced to vote because they needed to reach 10%. I think that may be fair. On the other hand, I guess you got to start somewhere. So, I'm not saying it's perfect, but I do think that's probably the way that you will ultimately get women to vote on issues rather than just being forced.
And anecdotally, I mean, some of these places where women hadn't voted in southern Punjab, interior Sindh, and in KPK, it was really the religious parties who actually were very organized among women. JUIF, Jamaat Islami, I mean, JUIF did a really good job in some of the places in the Northwest, bringing out their women supporters and having their women party people out there.
And,
so it's not who you expect.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
And I just want to note that the PMLN actually had the first television ad in Pakistan that was exclusively catered to women. So it's a center-right party, generally not associated with women's empowerment, but it, because of its, it had a very empowered social services unit, reform unit within the Punjab provincial government, and so they pushed forward. They were even trying to frame public transportation as a women's rights issue, and to some extent it is. It's about safety in terms of traveling to and from work and all that. So there are some changes. There are some indicators that there is increasingly split voting in terms of households. That women don't necessarily, at least in urban centers, follow what the man in the house says and votes on their accord. And I think that advertising reflects an attempt to cater to that independent woman voter.
On the first question,
On blasphemy?
No, first one was
First
Kamran's question, no?
Kamran's.
The link between the domestic compulsion to include
India.
Yeah.
and does it compel Pakistan as a state with all its factions to take a different look at India?
Yeah. I think it's a question of benchmarks. So change the word compulsion to choice. I think basically if your benchmark is full potential, there is no way you can do it with a closed region. That's as true for India as it is for Pakistan and more true for Afghanistan. Can Pakistan still grow at 6-7% minus that? Yes, if the domestic reforms take place and CPEC actually takes off as you want. I think there's overwhelming consensus in the establishment sort of powers that be that we have to quote unquote do this minus the India part because India is not willing to play ball. I think that's where you're going to go. But if you unlock the region, any economist will tell you there's no rocket science, it'll go up. But the political part of that, I think, is insurmountable for the next 5 years.
Okay, let's have 2 more questions back all the way in. Sorry?
Blasphemy.
I
Same
think we really did touch on that earlier.
It'll be same old. Same old.
Yeah. Dana?
Thank you. It's Dana Marshall with Transnational Strategy Group. I wonder if the panel could give an opinion about, in light of all of the factors that have been put out, the economic situation, the situation with China, new U.S. talks with the Afghan Taliban directly, all of these other things, what is the scope, realistically, for this election being seen in Washington, and perhaps in Islamabad as well, as a turning of the page? Or are we going to see basically a continuation of the same old frictions, but now with a new government, a very new government in Pakistan?
I can.
Okay, yeah, I'll let you, okay, down here.
Question, Mohammed Tahir from
Well,
Radio.
just one question.
Okay.
Because we're wrapping up now.
Okay, Mohammed Tahir from Radio Free or Radio Liberty. How do you see Nawaz Sharif's future? And also, what is the calculation within the Tariq-Insaf about him? What's the calculation with Shehbaz Sharif's camp? And Asif Zardari, he's supposed to go to court for corruption cases. How do you see that's going to develop?
Okay.
I can,
Panelists?
yeah, I'll answer the first question, Dana's question, and I'll answer it in a way that will honor Marvin, who always likes to be a skeptic. So I'll be a skeptic. How will this election be seen? I think certainly there's a recognition that it is a milestone in the sense that 10 years of uninterrupted civilian rule, that type of thing. But I'm struck by if we think back to 5 years ago, after the 2013 election. I remember there being a fair amount of optimism that things were going to happen. You had this new PMLN government with a large mandate. You had Nawaz Sharif, who was going to be pushing for big reforms, pushing closer to India. There was a fair amount of optimism in this town at that point. But of course, we see what happened in the 5 years that followed. And likewise now, I mean, in this town, there's not a lot of optimism about this election. I think that this narrative of the military having engineered a particular outcome is very strong among many here. Whereas in Pakistan, I do think that certainly the PTI, Imran Khan, very polarizing figures. But my sense, based on conversations with folks in Pakistan the last few days, is there's actually a lot of optimism that maybe this guy could really do something different. But again, sometimes when one has optimism, things don't work out as they should. And I think we need to really be modest in our expectations as to if things will really improve for the better, for many of the reasons that we've been discussing over the last 90 minutes.
We had a question here about Nawaz Sharif and his fate.
Could I just say something on this?
Yes,
Nawaz Sharif's fate, you need a crystal ball. But on this one, I do worry, Marvin, about the US-Pakistan relationship on another count, which is that the conversation in Washington about Pakistan is completely divorced from the conversation about Pakistan in Pakistan. There's no link left between the two. And I don't only say this for this election, even in the past 5 years, as you know, I spent a lot of time in Pakistan. The kind of conversations Pakistan is having about its future, about its youth, about its economy, some of the local level vibrancy, the conversations about what census will do, the migration part, that has completely disappeared from this town. And here the conversation is, if the safe havens disappear, Afghanistan will be Denmark and Pakistan will be grateful to Pakistan. May or may not be true. The point here is, if we want a bilateral conversation with the country, at the end of the day, there needs to be some common ground in how both sides are looking at the country's future. I find that to be a completely broken conversation, to the point that I don't know how much time Pakistani and US policymakers are spending on anything but this particular point about Afghanistan. If that's true, if miraculously tomorrow we resolve this Afghanistan issue, I think we won't know where to go with this relationship after that. And my worry is somebody will get up and say, we're done, 1990 moment, we'll come back when we need. And that was the biggest mistake that was made in the past.
But let me just quickly. But in 1990, Pakistan did not have nuclear weapons. In 1990, we didn't worry about global terrorism. Those
But Marvin, that's the problem. Pakistanis are not talking about nuclear weapons every day.
No.
What I'm saying is that there has to be some common framing where we need to go with this, and that's just, it's not only missing, the fact is I don't find people anymore who are actually focused on those issues.
I would completely agree with Moeed. I think the narrow lens, so U.S. interests vis-a-vis Pakistan have been defined, I would argue, since the Bush administration, Obama administration, and even the Trump administration, looking at Afghanistan, nuclear security, counterterrorism, and India. And those continue to be the lens through which we look at Pakistan. And they're all negatives. There is no positive part of what we look at. And I would argue that it's even narrowed even more. It's just about Afghanistan. That is such a huge issue in Washington. How can we win or get out or finish up anything in Afghanistan that you can't see beyond that? I mean, I talk to many people who are going out to Pakistan, first tour officers, diplomats, others, and they ask me about, can you tell us about the tribal makeup of Pakistan? I mean, so there's so little sense that Pakistan, the Indus Valley civilization, that it's much closer, what is Punjab like, a breadbasket, that it is not tribal like Afghanistan. It's hard to explain to people going out. So there is just this very, very narrow lens through which we see Pakistan. And I would contrast that. A few months ago, I was in Beijing, and Beijing sees Pakistan. I met with folks there who are concentrating on Pakistan, thinking about Pakistan 30 years from now. They're thinking about modern, moderate Muslim Pakistan. They want some sort of vision of Pakistan that aligns with the Chinese vision. And I think that is much more of the conversation that's happening in Pakistan than the conversation that's happening here in Washington.
And there's not only a divide between the conversation about Pakistan in Pakistan, between that, the conversation in Pakistan and the conversation in the United States. There's also a divide between New York and Washington. I split my time between New York and Washington, and I consult companies that invest in Pakistan, and they're not asking about the safety of the nuclear weapons. They're not asking me about, the blasphemy or whatever. They compare Pakistan not to Somalia, not to Yemen, not to Afghanistan, but to Turkey. Countries that have, emerging markets that are more or less established in sort of this emerging market space and have gone through challenges, these structural reforms, political upheaval, and have achieved some sort of stasis. Turkey is a different story today, but it has catapulted into one of the world's largest economies. And so they're looking for that growth story, and it's a large country. I visit Pakistan, sometimes twice a year, and even in my own family, my own extended family, I see these market changes in terms of consumption. My own aunt who's, in 70s using Uber, and she's going from point A to point B, and, she lives in a middle class area. So there is a growing, there are changes in terms of consumption, there are changes in terms of attitudes. Politics is a part of daily life. People just sit in front of the TV and watch the 25 plus cable news channels, and they're talking about politics, and that's why we're seeing sort of sustained levels of voter turnout. But it's a very dynamic country, and I think we need to many of the people who talk about Pakistan in this town don't really go outside the cordons of the Serena, and they're not able to see the country as it is. I went to Pakistan, I met with high-level officials, but I also took the bus, and I wanted to see what these new public transportation projects were like.
I have one line, Marvin, if you may. I want to be clear. The point I'm making is not that we need to see Pakistan in a different light for Pakistan's sake. The point I'm making is nobody lost more than the US because of the 1990 decision. And if we are going to do anything that's going to get us closer to that, we need to pull back from that. And one of the ways to do that is to find common framing. Michael talked about diaspora. How do you get the diaspora engaged if the only conversation is safe havens? They're not going to fix that. Right? So, I mean, that's sort of the space that I think we need to keep in mind.
I think the point was also made that Afghanistan has taken all the air out of everything else. And so we'll never get there until somehow there's a resolution. Unfortunately, we may have to wait a while. But we're not going to wait a while to close shop here. This has been exhausting because there's been so much said, and I hope you all feel, as I do, that we are far better informed about Pakistan, what's going on, than when we arrived. And let's show our appreciation to the panelists.